started D'Addario over, we were just like getting the factory going, and we were essentially making a D'Angelico string. Pretty quickly, I started to just explore different metals. And I had one of these machinist handbooks that's about that thick, and a whole section on metallurgy. I was intrigued by the description of phosphor bronze. So we started to look to see if anybody made phosphor bronze wire. And it turns out that the mesh screens that they make for paper making were primarily made from phosphor bronze wire. And they started making these meshes out of other materials, and then there was some capacity of phosphor bronze manufacturing of wire out there that was available in looking for business. We got some samples in the diameters we needed, and I made the strings and took them home, and I said, holy shit, these are really good. This is like significantly different and better than, all the stuff everyone else has been using. This just set a new standard. The phosphor bronze is a more durable alloy, so string tone lasts a little bit longer, had a different sound. I think a more like even sound. 80-20s can be really loud on the fundamental and very bright, whereas the phosphor bronze just seems to be more balanced. And almost everybody I sampled, and they were really good people that we were testing with. Phosphor bronze was getting some high marks. As soon as we put those strings out, we had a lot of demand. We had people ordering them from all over the world. When people tried it, they usually came back liking it right away. They also liked the idea that there was a choice, there was a difference. I remember having an argument with my dad. I put phosphor bronze on the package. He says, "Oh, you're making a big mistake. We shouldn't tell everyone. Everyone else is going to copy it." And I said, so what? It's phosphor bronze. Ours is going to be better. We kind of told a story about phosphor bronze and what's in it and why it's better. It's a different alloy. We started to get some real traction in 1976. That just set us apart. There wasn't anybody else had that, and it put the brand name on the map. And then we made XL110s. Essentially was the Darko funky string that my dad developed. It was a nickel-plated steel string in the gauges that Ernie Ball slinkies were. Ernie Ball was the pioneer with thin-gauged rock and roll sets in the early 60s. He was the first to introduce those, and you got to give him credit. Basically, he took a set of medium-gauge jazz set of strings that we would make for D'Angelico with 13, 17, 26, 36, 46, 56, and he threw away the 56. He moved the 5 up one string, and he put a 10 on the top. And there's your regular slinkies and your XL110s and everybody else's. Back then, we simply took what my dad had developed with the nickel-plated steel, which was a round wound string. It wasn't roller wound and pressed. I was never an advocate for that. I liked the real bright round wound string. And that's what funkies were, and that's what XLs were when they came out. And the package was actually inspired by Lucky Strike cigarette package with the circle. I always was impressed with the way that stood out in a candy store or a pharmacy. Eventually, we came up with lots of clever stuff like that whole imagery of the cows, the way they were illustrated. And Ben & Jerry's ice cream came out about 2 years later, and there was our cows on their trucks. So somebody must have seen it and said, hey, this is great for ice cream. But we sold over 100,000 of those t-shirts. It was ridiculous. And posters and stickers. We put hundreds of thousands of stickers into sets of strings. And then we had that series of airbrushed ads. I had the idea of putting this label, just the label, in a wine bottle with a cork, with nothing else but that. We didn't say message in a bottle, or we didn't say that, Andy Summers uses our strings. That was an ad. It was immensely popular. And we could always tell because on the bottom we would say send for a poster, and we would keep track of each magazine, what ads had the most response, and then somebody had a poster in his bedroom forever. That message in the bottle theme, why don't we do something where we try to illustrate other rock songs? Blue Suede Shoes and Pinball Wizard, and it was a great campaign. One of the very early things that I worked on in the factory was developing half rounds. And we developed the half round grinding process, which is basically like two grinding wheels. One of them is a work wheel that does the cutting, and the other one's what they call a regulating wheel. Initially, we used pure nickel wrap wires, and we ground them, depending on the diameter of the string, anywhere from 5 to 15 thousandths of an inch off the string. And essentially what it's doing is it's taking a string with a round wrap wire, which is kind of like a spring, and it's grinding the surface to be more like a flat wound string. And the first thing we put out was bass strings, and we just took the market by surprise with that product in 1976, and it was a huge success. I had to buy a couple more grinders like almost immediately, and additional bass winding machines had to be built. And it really put us in the bass string business because a lot of people were still using flat wound strings. There was a crowd that liked round wound strings, and there was a crowd that liked flat wound. But here we came along with something in the middle, and the market was really ready for that at that moment. We also put out the guitar string version. Then later on, we put out this Series 2, which was a stainless steel version. We've developed our flat wound winding capabilities so that we make a really decent sounding flat wound string that intonates great. So people gravitate towards that or the round wound strings, which are still the most popular. And it established us as being different than everything else. Like, here are these guys that come along and they're focused just on strings and they know what they're doing. Sometime in 75 or 76, my friend Dave Scholemson calls me and says, "You gotta hear this kid play the guitar." We went to see Pat Metheny in the Village. There had to be like 10 people in the audience. Nobody knew who he was. And we were like just blown away, and we went backstage, and I was just starting to develop flat wound strings. And I said, "Well, I'm working on some strings. Would you test them?" And somebody said, "Yeah, absolutely." So, we collaborated a bunch.
I kind of talked with Jimmy D'Addario a few times about a way of getting a string that sounded a little bit dead, which is kind of the antithesis of what most people want in a string. We came up with this version of a chrome flat wound string that had a kind of dark component to the sound, but still was like bright and in tune at the same time. I mean, it's kind of an odd combination of things, but worked out really good what they came up with.
He wanted them to be really dead sounding, but still have great intonation and playability, right? And a lot of the flat wound strings were dead sounding on the market, but they weren't wound well, so they didn't intonate well. And he's really picky about intonation. He loved them, so he's been a great ally of ours from his early days when we first met him. We ended up trying to develop a great string in every category of guitar strings, whether it was classical, rock and roll, electric guitar, acoustic guitar, steel string, mandolin, electric bass. We have a good market position in every category because we worked really hard to develop those strings. And then around 77, 78, I started to really concentrate on figuring out how to wind the best nylon core string. Dad used to like to go to Asia and call on the guitar factories. He found a monofilament extrusion company, and their material was far superior to what DuPont was making here in the United States. Very consistent in one length of a string, to within a half a thousandth of an inch, which was significantly better than anything else. It was a slightly denser formula. It was a better sounding nylon. It was nice and bright. It projected well. It had good fundamental. I loved it. We introduced the Pro Arte strings in '79, and Janet and I would go to various concerts to see if we can get samples to really big name players, and it was really hard because they were all had personal relationships with either Augustine or Savarez. So we decided that the easier thing to do would be to get the younger artists that were just coming out of college, and they all were like, "Wow, this is a good product." And we wanted to figure out some way of helping them with their careers. So we started the D'Addario Foundation. We started in 79 or 80 with one concert at Town Hall with Michael Newman at Merkin Hall near Lincoln Center. And back then, if you had a debut, you get a review in the New York Times. It would kick-start their career. That's how we met Ben Verdery, who became very close friends, and David Russell and David Leisner and Alice Arts and David Starobin, Jorge Morel, Fred Hand, and then we added San Francisco and Washington, D.C., and later on Dallas. So we started to get more like ingrained with the artists, and it was a lot easier for us to test strings and learn what they wanted and what they didn't want. That was really key to us developing the respect of the classical guitarist, which was hard to do. It's really important that we can satisfy the most discriminating artists and luthiers, and they've been so helpful over the years helping us design product, debug products. It isn't just about promoting them and helping each other commercially. It's really kind of a partnership that's really, really important. You can't develop products for the highest level performers unless you have those relationships. People that really knew were attracted to our product, and I think even to this day, a lot of people might start with a different brand, but they eventually gravitate to D'Addario because it is the most consistent, reliable, great sounding string available.